think we introduced ourselves earlier on. I am a lawyer by training, but I am an associate with People, Land and Rural Development, which is a think tank on issues of the interaction between land rights and sustainable rural development. What I would like to present here is something that I'm struggling with. There are more questions here than there are answers. I have had the privilege of being involved in the policy reform process, and particularly with regards to strengthening community land rights. And Kenya has made significant progress in policy reform. But the questions that I want to discuss now and to raise are the extent to which policy reforms actually end up strengthening community land rights. I'm looking at the land policy in Kenya as a case study of this. The point I want to make is really just one, but it's I can explain it by those 3 bullets. One is that the dispossession of communities from their land, their marginalization, the weakening of community land rights and institutions of land governance was done historically through policy and law. And therefore it is understandable that it is to policy and law that we look when we are thinking of reasserting and reclaiming land rights. The problem is that when we seek to reform policies for land governance, we seek to fit ideas about community land governance within a policy, legal, and institutional framework that is almost antithetical to the idea of communal land rights. The values that underpin the overall policy framework that we are seeking to reform are values that are often at variance with community values with regards to land. As a result, when reforms have been done, what comes out of those reforms tend to, they seek to transform the character of community land and community land relations. The end result of that is that there is a possibility, there's a danger that actually policy and legal reforms end up weakening rather than strengthening communal land, and communal land rights. And that's what I'm struggling with in Kenya. When you talk about community land in Kenya, it's a substantial proportion of the land mass. The red part is the arid, and I think that's orange. What's the color after red? I'm a little color blind with my glasses. But this part is, this is semi-arid, this is arid. So in the semi-arid and in the arid and semi-arid parts of the country, community land is held communally. So community land holdings are a key issue. When we talk about community land in Kenya, we're talking about a large chunk of the national landscape, and therefore this is an important issue for conservation and conservation, but it's also an important issue for livelihoods and for development. In fact, for conservation, especially nature conservation, is most of the protected areas are actually within those same areas. So community land is an important issue in Kenya. And in fact, the land reform process in Kenya, the land policy reform process in Kenya, was pretty much driven by ideas about how to strengthen community land. We've gone through a decade of reforms in Kenya, and these are the significant instruments that came out of the reform process, starting with in 2009 with the National Land Policy, followed in 2010 by the Constitution, followed in 2012 by the National Policy for Development of Northern Kenya and Other Arid Lands. The land laws have been reformed and updated in order to bring them in line with the new constitutional dispensation. Prior to these reforms, which, as you can see with the dates of the laws, are between 2012 and 2016. Prior to that, prior to the national land policy and the new constitution, we had like 70 different pieces of legislation touching on different aspects of land. And one of the reform objectives was to try to consolidate, land laws within a framework that is manageable. So these are land laws that give effect to the new land policy and the new land dispensation. Of importance to community land are the ones I'm listing are the ones that are relevant to community land. The Land Act, the Land Registration Act, the Community Land Act, and the Community Land Regulations, which are for implementation of the Community Land Act. The County Governments Act is important because it gives effect to the devolution provisions of the Constitution, creates county governments, and therefore brings structures of governance closer to the people. And the National Land Use Policy was adopted last year, which is also of significance to issues of community land management. The major reforms, I'll just highlight a few. The National Land Policy is important for articulating measures for securing community land rights. And among the measures that were proposed by the National Land Policy, legislation was just one of the measures. There were a number of measures, but legislation was one of those measures. But if you look at the process of implementing the policy, legislation became the centerpiece in the conversation. So it moved from all the other measures plus legislation to legislation as the centerpiece for reform. In the Constitution recognized community land as a category of land holding and defined the community as holders of land rights, as legal holders of land rights who could be registered as holders of land rights. And communities are defined on the basis of ethnicity, culture, or as the Constitution says, similar community of interest. The Constitution also introduced devolution. The Land Registration Act establishes the Community Land Register, which is supposed to have a cadastre, it's supposed to have details of the community, members of the community, the land use system of the community, and the registered group representatives. Those details are supposed to be held in what the community land is. In other words, creating a land registration system for community land is seen as an important part of this reform process. And then the Community Land Act is the legislative implementing framework for the reforms that touch on community land. And it affirms the legal equality of customary land rights. In other words, customary land rights have the same force in law as other rights acquired by other means, freehold, leasehold, or rights acquired through allocation, etc. But the Community Land Act also distinguishes between registered community land and unregistered community land. Unregistered community land is held by the county government in trust on behalf of the communities. It is registered community land which is held by communities. It also makes a claim of a community land conditional on the community getting registered. In other words, even though the Act and these policy instruments define a community in terms of ethnicity, culture, or similar community of interest, in order to claim land, the community has to be registered. So the community that claims land is not the ethnic, the socio-cultural institution, but the legally registered entity. And I'm flagging that because it's important for the conversation I want to have. And it repeals the Group Representatives Act and the Trust Land Act, which was seen as legislation that have not properly secured community land rights in the past. So the issues that arise in this is what are the effects or implications of registration for the nature of a community and community organization. When we say that you have to register a community so that it has a certificate of registration and has a committee in charge in order to be able to claim its land rights, the end result of that process, what you end up with that is now claiming this community land, is it the same thing as the community as we understand it when we make claims of community land rights? Number two, what is the impact of distinguishing between registered community land and unregistered community land? the overall understanding on the part of communities is that these reforms and the Community Land Act have strengthened community land holdings. But that's not true. Because the truth is, your community land, until it is registered, is no different today than it was in 2008. In other words, the security of tenure you hold over community land is conditional on registering a community and registering the community land. Because you cannot register community land until you have registered the community. And until you do that, your land is unregistered. If it is unregistered, it is held by the county government. The difference between the county government and the county council under the Trust Land Act is that in the Trust Land Act, the county councils held traditional land on behalf of communities, but there's no definition of what their trust obligations were. But now, under the Community Land Act, it is specified that the county government will hold the land on trust on behalf of communities, and there are even responsibilities about sharing income, whatever income comes, accounting for income on that land to the community. And also the fact that now, unlike in the past, they cannot unilaterally just make a decision to allocate that land. There's a process which underpins that. But the third question is the third question, to what extent does the community land regime that is articulated by the Community Land Act, to what extent is that in accord with the nature of communal land tenure? In fact, the thing I'm struggling with is we all say, I think even I have made this statement in the past, that the new framework has recognized community land tenure. But again, when I read the Constitution and all the documents that I've referred to, there's no place where this is referred to as community land tenure. What the Constitution says is that land in Kenya shall be classified into 3 categories: public, private, and community. And when you read the Land Act, the details in the Land Act actually says community land can be held in any category of land holding recognized by law in Kenya. Which means that community land can actually be held as freehold, can actually be held as leasehold, can actually be held as community land. Hence the question is, where is the security of tenure? Fourth, is it possible, is it feasible to uphold customary land rights, which is the claim of this reform, within a legal context that does not recognize customary law? Because what's interesting is, if you look at the reforms in Kenya, the Constitution, the National Land Policy, and all the instruments, there's nowhere where the word customary law appears. And yet, we are saying that we are recognizing customary land rights. Customary land rights are underpinned by customary law. So, and is it possible to actually recognize customary land rights when we don't recognize customary law? And finally, is it possible to strengthen community land rights without recognizing the role of traditional institutions? Because in none of those instruments is there any reference to traditional institutions. So how are we strengthening community land rights, customary land rights, community land holdings, and yet we are not recognizing the role of traditional institutions? So to conclude, the need to address lack of tenure security in communal lands was one of the major drivers of land-related reforms, the ones that I've made reference to. But it appears to me that the levels of ambition about securing community land diminish progressively as we move away from the general policy statements to the implementing framework. If you read the National Land Policy and the Constitution, there's a very rosy picture of strengthening community land rights. When you come to the Community Land Act and the Community Land Regulations, and you read the details, as they say, the devil is in the details, you find that what is given by the right hand is taken away by the left hand. The thing that worries me is that all of us involved in this conversation are not paying attention to what is being done to the promise of reform by the detailed provisions of law that are being articulated by bureaucrats, people who from the beginning were opposed to the idea of strengthening community land rights. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, of course.
Thank you for a very nuanced presentation. analysis. And I just see all kinds of parallels between the problem as you posed it and other settings in Canada, Australia, which themselves are quite different. And you know, if we could risk again talking about relational ontology, but never mind ontology, just the relational. Like, this is the huge dilemma, isn't it? That there are many places in the world functioning relational systems that proceed according to their own indigenous character, often in contexts where they've been under the radar of the state law. They continue to operate according to their own cultural genius until something comes and interferes with them. And then the state gets interested because there's a mine or there's a hydro project or settlement ambitions or whatever. So then you have this inevitable, if the space for that customary tenure, customary governance to survive is to be defended, that you have to then be in conversation with the state and with state law. And so it becomes this communication problem of, you know, matching categories of within state law strategically to realities on the ground, and I guess inevitably transformation of realities on the ground in the process of self-defense at best. So, you know, I suppose then, you know, to relate this to Canadian contexts, I don't know of a case in which that territorial defense has occurred without a redefinition, a reorganization of polity, and to some extent a reorganization of customary tenure dynamics and relations. But it is often done quite self-consciously and strategically, with the goal of protecting certain things that the people hold dear, that the communities hold dear, and at the same time recognizing that new institutions of self-determination at best must be developed to protect this space. So it's a hybrid. It's a very hybrid thing, you know, to invoke the metaphor that was used earlier, judo or jiu-jitsu, this hegemony, counter-hegemony kind of game, where indigenous categories and practices are being negotiated with those of states.
When we were pushing for the land policy, and I was really at the center of this, what we were hoping for, and I was in the committee that made proposals to inform the community land provisions of the land policy. What we were hoping for, what we were asking the government to do, was to provide legal recognition for community systems. Because we were saying it is the lack of legal recognition that allows a situation where whenever community management systems interface with any outsider interest, community systems lose. So we wanted a legal recognition of community systems. That's all we wanted. We wanted the detailed management of that to be left to the community system. Because once you recognize them as legal, then it means that whatever decisions they make are binding. That's all you're asking for. But what has happened now is that as you move from the policy to the law, the technocrats within government have taken over. and are defining the details. They're not talking about communities as we recognize them. They're actually talking about legal entities that will allow them to better manage and better control this. And that's what I feel. And the thing that scares me is that none of us seems to be alive to this reality. Because unlike policy making processes which are openly political and where communities can relate, law making processes are very technical. And what communities receive is often in language that many of them don't really understand. There are people in this room who are very deeply involved in this, but if I ask them if they have read the community land regulations, the answer is likely to be no. It's not because they don't want to, it's because that process is so shrouded in technique, in legalese and technical things that it's away from them. But that is where they take back, they claw back on the promise of the political process that you find in the land policy and in the constitution. Because at the end of the day, the question I'm asking myself, what's the difference between what is on offer now in the Community Land Act and the group ranches? Really, in real terms, what is the difference, other than the fact that the names are different and some words have been used that are more acceptable? What is the concrete difference? And I'm not sure that there is a difference. So my presentation is an invitation, especially those of us who are here, to engage with this process much more intimately and to interrogate it a little more. I think we are making assumptions which are not necessarily being backed by instruments that are coming out of this process.
So we're running very late, so I just want maybe just one or two last quick questions. And,
this is fascinating and important. And the land system has gone through transformations. And when we think about the Maasai Reserve and trust land and privatization through group ranches, etc., what we see is a sequencing of tenure forms. And my suspicion is that although the legal forms have evolved, and the lawyers know where they are at, that in fact all of the systems are there in terms of the minds of people and what they respect and the anticipations they have, the claims they make, that they're all there, and it's sort of in layers. And now we have a new layer. So I wonder, the way you've presented it, it's almost as if they're setting a little time bomb in that legislation. And what they're going to do is something peculiar when they have community land that is not registered. Watch out, because then they could well use that as a, I don't know who the they is, but the theys are always there. They'll use that as a way of seizing land from communities, or some members of the community will take it from others. That's the undertone. And then you're going to have a set of expectations based on previous tenure forms, and people will not accept it. So what one might be opening up to is a big mess, rather than this being a move that would sort of resolve some of the problems under the group ranch and the subdivisions, etc. You're anticipating, or at least fearing, a big mess.
Yeah, and what we did in the policy was we as I said, this legislation was just one of the measures. And it comes below. The first proposition in the policy was that to secure community land, the first thing that was supposed to be done was to map out where the community land is, what the nature of the community land is, and to generate principles that would then, general principles would then inform legislation. When the implementation started, they went straight to legislation. There are no principles, so we're basically regurgitating experiments which have been done in the past, which have failed in the past, rewording them to make them align with the present, and that is where my fear is.
Just the question of who is in the community. pointed out is a really important issue. Of course, in the group rent registers, people on the registers are owners. It's sort of a circular thing. But who should be unregistered? Is it people residing in a certain area? Sometimes. But then sometimes they chuck the ones off they don't recognize. Or sometimes people from the outside come in and the people who are actually resident there are left off. There's no confessing. That's but I don't see any hints that they have resolved the question of residency versus traditional claim.
The Constitution says community shall be identified by ethnicity, custom, and any other, shared rights.
Any others are presumably
any other is the opening. And the any other was introduced because people say, no, there are many areas where people are now, living together. There's been in-migration and so on. So you can't insist on ethnicity as the measure. So community is supposed to be not just ethnic communities. It's also supposed to be defined on the basis of geography. So that, for instance, in slum areas, in residential areas, in the urban areas, that is considered a community of purposes of this. So they can actually get registered. And it might work very well in those contexts, but it's going to be fairly complex when it goes to the communities for whom it was meant.
Justin, do you have a question? No? Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you are very right in the sense that this was one of the struggle to actually get the act to go through Parliament was one of the toughest, and it is deliberate and intentional. Because if you look in how the land is distributed, the map, that's where the government interests are. That's where the major infrastructure is. And government wanted certain projects to go through. That's one. The other thing is they are minor, they are important, but you could call them minor changes. For instance, where women can now register directly without going through their spouses, the way it was in the group ranch executive act. The other thing is also what I'm trying to drive at, and we agree with you. The burden of registering communities and lands is actually put upon communities. That's the most. This a law that is coming without a budget. So communities have to raise money to register their own lands, and it converts into millions of shillings. So, and reading through the regulations, communities have up to about 16 months to register their lands, and also including registering themselves. And already we are seeing red lights. We are doing red lights in northern Kenya, including Laikipia. They are Laikipia Samburus. They are, Samburus resident in Laikipia. And they are already group branches are saying, no, we now want to amend the registers. We want to get these guys out. That's our red pointer. Already in certain areas, Trustland, we anticipate very armed conflicts in respect to this. So if not handled carefully, there will be explosion in northern Kenya because of the investment. People know it comes with money, and it's about internal interest, external interest. And the other thing is, it's intentional for government to do this so that certain communities living within the Maasai, for instance, cannot be excluded. What happens, as you know, in the group ranches. So this is just a comment. We know we have people who have never been like Laikipia who are members of the group ranch, and they cannot be removed.
Two things to note. One is you can see the legislation is the Community Land Act is 2016. The other legislation in 2012. That's the point it's making. The one for Community Land Act is the one that was most delayed. But also we need to remember, concurrent with these processes, there are other reforms going on. One is the stipulation by government that all land must be registered within 10 years. 10 years since 2009. So if it's not registered, then what? Anyway, so the struggle is still out there.
Well, please give a huge round of applause.